Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is your host, Kyle Buller, and I am recording this intro in the Netherlands. I'm actually here for the ICPR conference and really excited to be here. And kind of a funny story leading into this episode was, I was thinking that I needed to record this intro. I was a little busy before taking off and getting ready. And I ran into Dr. Rick Barnett at the airport. And so today's episode is with Dr. Rick Barnett. So I was at the Newark airport walking around and bumped into him and was not expecting it since Rick lives in Vermont. So really funny synchronicity there. And he's also at the ICPR conference as well. So yeah, this episode is with Dr. Rick Barnett. If you want to learn more about his work, you can go back into our archive. He's been on the podcast before. And so this episode was recorded live in person in Burlington, Vermont. We put on a small little event. This was right after Rick's conference, the Psychedelic Society of Vermont, that happened in June up at the Von Trapp Lodge up at Stowe. Awesome conference. If you've been following us, we probably were posting, and we recorded this little live event down in Burlington, and it was called the Paradigms of Various Psychedelic Use, or something along those lines. So this is kind of like a nice little intro around how people are using psychedelics and what each psychedelic may be used for, either in the clinical context or how people may be exploring it on their own. So yeah, this may be kind of like a review for some people, but also a really great episode to kind of recap the various use paradigms. And, this might be a really great episode to share around to some friends and family members if this is totally new to them and they want to learn. So I'll leave it at that. I hope you enjoy this episode. It was fun to finally get back in person and do a little live event, and hopefully more to come. But I would definitely check out the Vermont Psychedelic Society, or the Psychedelic Society of Vermont. Again, they put on a really wonderful conference back in June of 2022. And I think they have one in the works for the fall equinox in 2023. So keep your eyes and ears out for that. Yeah, it was really awesome. Other exciting news. So Psychedelics Today, we are launching Psychedelics Tonight. So we've partnered up with altered.tv, which is a streaming platform. You can find it on Roku and any kind of smart TV, smart app. You can get on Apple, Android, Roku, Plex, etc. So this is actually launching on Monday, September 26th. At 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is a show that Joe and I helped put together in studio, did some video recording, which was super fun and also kind of new for us too. So you can check that out. If you go to your Roku or smart TV app, you can probably find that there. It's altered.tv, and it's ALTRD.tv. It's kind of like the Gaia for psychedelics, crypto, and cannabis, and kind of like the alternative world. So really excited about this. We have 5 episodes, one on novel compounds, other one is on tryptamines, and then we have an episode on iboga and ibogaine. So again, that's going to be dropping on September 26th at 3 p.m. And then every new episode will drop every Monday through October, and it's free to stream. So again, definitely check that out. We're really excited about it. I think that's it for some of the intro. Just a reminder, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're feeling called, leave a review. That always helps us out if you're really appreciating the show here. And if you want to leave a small monthly donation, you can do so at patreon.com/psychedelics today. And I think that's it. So I hope you all enjoy this episode with Dr. Rick Barnett, and we'll catch you on the other side. Hey, welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're probably just going to engage in a little bit of conversation, but since we have a small little turnout, I think we can kind of just ask some questions along the way too. So my name is Kyle Buller. I'm one of the co-founders at Psychedelics Today. We're a psychedelic media and education company. We got started in 2016, so we're 6 years in. And I actually got my kind of psychedelic career started to some degree right here in Burlington. I went to a little school called Burlington College, which closed down in 2013. So it feels like a little bit of a homecoming whenever I come back to Burlington. And it was really fun. Rick here just put on a conference for the Vermont Psychedelic Society, and he's a co-founder there. So it was really fun to kind of see the community building here in Vermont. Rick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Rick Barnett. I'm a clinical psychologist in Stowe. I'm also addiction specialist. So I mostly do private practice, frontline, clinical counseling work right there out of my office. And, some 50% addictions, 50% general practice, adults, individual therapy. And I was able to co-found the Psychedelic Society of Vermont last June, after I finished a year-long training in psychedelic therapy and research through the California Institute on Integral Studies. That was done during COVID. It was all online. Fortunately, there was a small cohort of us that got together several times during the course of the year with taking our COVID test and everything. And so we got to actually take the classes online with each other in the room. So we were together. We made it work. And that training program was fantastic. But I had been interested in psychedelics prior to that. Michael Pollan's book had come out in 2018, I think, and had taken a look at that and started to get really interested in the potential. And I have a personal history of psychedelic use going back into my teenage years. Profoundly impacted my life. So I had a natural inclination to sort of say, oh, what's going on here? Like, legitimately, I want to study this. If this is actually going to happen in terms of treatment, then I want to be on the front lines of it. I want to be part of the whole thing. And so, we founded the Psychedelic Society of Vermont. There's about 80 or so now members. I say members. A lot of lurkers on our Google group. They don't necessarily respond to things that are going on. But it's a good, healthy group. And we had this fantastic conference last week on the solstice, Monday and Tuesday, with about 125 people and some great presenters. Some of you were here, were there, and it was really, really cool. So it's kind of neat to see the community building around that. Really focused on healthcare practitioners at this point, but really wanting to sort of broaden it out to larger community. And how do we integrate the science that's happening, the research, with what's already happening out there in communities. There are people using psychedelics in ceremonial use, in celebration, for recreation, and I want to integrate it all because there's no wrong door here, I think.
Yeah, that might be a good place to kind of kick off. I know when we thought about talking about hosting this event, you kind of pitched out this various uses of context for psychedelics. And Joe and I did an episode a number of years ago, and I think that was probably one of my favorite episodes, just because it seems that right now there's such a focus on medicalization, which we need, right? Like, we need the research, we need the science. It's been really helping to legitimize everything. But we also can't deny that, people are doing them in ceremonial contexts and on their own. And so I always love kind of diving into a little bit of the nuance there. And do you want to, I guess, just give a little recap of like some of the presenters at your conference and some of the research that was presented there around more of the psychotherapy aspect?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to bring a diverse group of people in there, a lot of leading researchers. We kicked it off with Dr. Ben Sessa from the UK, who wrote the book, The Psychedelic Renaissance, which is, I think, a fantastic sort of intro to the psychedelic research and world. He gave a fantastic sort of, overview of the whole thing. But he firmly works in a medical model. He represents he works for a biotech company, Awaken Life Science. He's worked for Imperial College and written research papers on MDMA and alcohol use disorder, ketamine and alcohol use disorder. He considers himself an MDMA and ketamine psychotherapist as a psychiatrist. So he actually does the work. So he spoke eloquently about, what it's like to do the actual therapy. Matt Johnson from Johns Hopkins was there on the opening the second day. He's participated in many, many research sessions with psilocybin and studied many other psychedelic molecules in a research setting. Chuck Raison, also from the USONA Institute, one of the few nonprofits in the psychedelic space, who has studied this widely. He didn't talk too much about the actual therapy. He was more about the science and sort of 5 questions for psychiatry as we move forward. But, one of the highlights for me was Victor Cabral, he didn't represent Fluence, but he works for Fluence now. But just an amazing man, African-American. No, he's actually part African-American, part
Caribbean.
Caribbean?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Dominican,
I think. Yeah. And he just told his story. He just told his story about how, using psychedelics opened up his eyes and mind and heart to how he's been conditioned by society, by the family and the culture that he grew up in, and not having seen as clearly as he did after or through his psychedelic experience, how we're all influenced by our own biases, racial biases, gender bias, all kinds of biases. And it was just a fantastic talk. And that's really a sort of a highlight for me, sort of how psychedelics can change our minds, not so much in terms of treating depression or PTSD or addiction, but really challenging us to see ourselves in the world differently, whether we have a psychiatric condition or not. And I think that was important point. And finally, there were a few other presenters, but Carolyn Dorson also gave a great talk from a nursing perspective. And her talk was entitled The Cosmology of Belonging. And she really emphasized community and how important it is. I mean, the research is important, Kyle, and we all know that. And arguably, I'd say community is way more important. Developing community. That was kind of the cool vibe with the conference. I think you guys might agree, those of us who were there. It really felt like a nice little community, not like hyper intimate, but way more intimate than a typical conference where people were really able to see each other eye to eye, hang out, talk, and feel each other's energy. All the presenters actually stayed in the room and listened to the other presenters talk, whereas normally, you kind of come in, give your talk, and then leave. But we all hung out together, and so there was a little bit of a glimpse of that. How can we build community? I hope we can sort of continue to do that from this conference moving forward. I think it feels really good.
I've been to lots of psychedelic conferences, and I would say it's probably the best one I've been to. And I'm one of those people that I don't really hang out and see a lot of the talks because I'm just in the hallways talking to people. So yeah, I really appreciate what you put on there. And it feels very Vermont, right? I mean, I feel like community is a very I don't know. That's how I feel when I really lived here. There's like community was like very central. Mm-hmm. Has anybody been really following the research and like knows what medicines are being used for like what indications for the most part, a little bit? Yeah, so maybe it makes sense to go through some of the research and describe what's being done in the research in psychotherapy. So those stickers over there for MAPS. MAPS really kind of streamlined a lot of this. They've been really focusing on MDMA, assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And it does seem to show pretty significant promise. I think the last clinical data that came out, around 65% of the participants that took MDMA came out without PTSD, which is pretty impressive. I mean, psychiatry really hasn't had too many great breakthroughs, and to have a medicine with a pretty significant outcome, I think is really awesome. So MDMA is really being examined for PTSD, but Ben Sessa has been doing a really interesting research on alcohol use disorder. And that also seems a little controversial. I think whenever we talk about substance use disorders, people go, well, you're kind of trading one substance to another substance. But psychedelics are a little bit different, right? They're not physically addictive for the most part. They're physically safe. And there is this kind of amplification effect that people can start to go inside and, kind of relive trauma, relive different experiences, recontextualize it. And MDMA seems to be a really great medicine for trauma and PTSD because it shuts down the left part of the amygdala, that fear processing part of the brain. And so in regular talk therapy, you may not be able to really get to a certain part, right, without getting triggered. You bring that up, your limbic system goes all crazy and you shut down or you want to get out. And it's really hard to process. Did you watch any of the MDMA training videos at CIS? Yeah, it was really, really fascinating. Just hearing some of the stories and seeing some of these, people that have been, one particular was a war vet, and just amazing to see how he was able to go go through some of the memories and kind of recontextualize some of the trauma that he went through. So MDMA it sounds like from what Rick Doblin was saying, 2024 is when they're looking to reschedule MDMA for psychotherapy. So it's definitely coming. It was supposed to be 2020, 2022. COVID kind of screwed things up, and now we're looking at 2024. So I think that's going to be really exciting for therapists, clinicians to have this in their toolkit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of the research has been focused on PTSD in veterans. And I would say also in those training videos, the MAPS training videos, because CIIS actually partners with MAPS. So you get a big chunk of the MAPS training when you do the CIIS training. One of the videos was a woman who was a person who experienced rape. And that was very intense to watch that video. And I think it's important to recognize that, there are some leading researchers in trauma. So Besser van der Kolk and Rachel Yehuda, even Gabor Mate, a lot of them are big supporters of MAPS and the clinical trials that are going on with MDMA and trauma. But yeah, I think Rick Doblin and others are pretty clear that while veterans are in high need, it's clearly a population that needs a lot of help. And if this can help them, then yes, we should be helping them with this tool if it shows that it works. But there's a whole huge group of people who could benefit. It's not just veterans. So it's important to recognize that. And I believe the leadership, they recognize that, it's being used for couples therapy, and even PTSD affecting, marriages badly. And so using it in that context too for veterans and their partners. And, going back to what you said about alcohol use disorder and MDMA, that's one of when you talk about the different psychedelics are being used or studied now for different conditions, addiction is kind of a weird one, right? Because addiction, you have so much comorbidity with trauma. You have so much comorbidity with depression and anxiety. And so I would say any psychedelic as a disrupting agent, addiction is a really, I've struggled with addiction myself. It's a really tough, they're all tough conditions, but it's really tough. So anything that you can apply to disrupt that addictive cycle. So whether that's ibogaine for opioid use disorder or stimulant use disorder, ketamine for alcohol use disorder, psilocybin for cocaine use disorder or nicotine use disorder, any of these agents that can really, basically get in there and jumble things up to help maybe see yourself and your relationship to that addictive behavior differently is a huge win, in my opinion. So it may be controversial in terms of one drug for another. And I would say ketamine and MDMA may have the most liability when it comes to getting really liking it too much, but I think that's why it's so important to have set and setting. So if you are using MDMA or ketamine for addictions, while they can be addictive in and of themselves, if you use it in that intentional way, I think it's very, very safe and very, very helpful.
Have you heard of MEAI?
Yeah. I heard a webinar with Mark Hayden, who used to be the head of MAPS Canada. I forgot what company he's a part of now. Clearmind. Yeah. That was so interesting. Totally different. It's another analog or something of MDMA but it's a different molecule.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did, Joe and I recorded a TV show that I think should be airing pretty soon, within July or August. But yeah, it seems to disrupt drinking. So people can take it, and one dose, it almost ceases your craving for it. And then I guess that maybe 3 doses in, it's almost like a low effect of MDMA. But everybody that we were talking to said it just stops it. So you take it and then you don't want to drink. Really interesting. So it's not psychedelic, but it's another really interesting medicine for substance. Alcohol use. You mentioned ibogaine. Do you want to explain a little bit about that in terms of substance use? Yeah,
you may know a little bit more about that than me, Kyle. Ibogaine was not actually talked about very much in my entire year-long training. It's just not discussed very often. And it's interesting, this from having started the Vital training program that you guys have, that 12-month program. Some programs focus on certain drugs, certain conditions, and some programs don't really cover the waterfront when it comes to all different psychedelics. So ibogaine is kind of a weird one. We didn't hear too much about it. I've heard a lot about it from underground, from people that I know, who stories that I've heard, documentaries that I've watched. But it's unique in the sense that it has a certain effect on the opioid receptor system, more so than any other psychedelic like drugs. I don't even know, like sometimes when people define like what is a psychedelic, how often, like even Ben Sessa's slides, how often do you see ibogaine on there? You don't.
It's not talked about much.
It's not talked about much, even though ibogaine. Yeah, it comes from the root iboga, IBOGA, and then the chemical version of it is INE, ibogaine, IBOGAINE, ibogaine. So it's used a lot, like in Costa Rica and Mexico to treat opioid use disorder and stimulant use disorder. And it does really help a lot of people. It basically like somehow rips all the opioids off your receptors, puts you in a psychedelic state for like 24, 48, 72 hours, really just floods you with this huge, like, grandfather iboga, right? It's just like something takes over for a long time and you come out of it. And I think the withdrawals, we know, opioid use disorder comes with terrible withdrawals. Well, the withdrawals, I think when you use ibogaine, I don't think they're taken away completely.
It does reset something in the brain where people don't have those cravings.
Not as much.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. I don't think it's a wonder drug by any stretch, because I know people that have actually had ibogaine treatments and gone out and overdosed and died. So it's not a cure-all. None of these drugs are, unfortunately, but they're definitely really hopeful tools that really do help quite a number of people. So ibogaine's a kind of a neat one.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, it comes from the iboga shrub in Africa, native of Gabon, and typically used in Bwiti rituals. And it kind of rites of passages and kind of to invoke a near-death-like experience. But also really interesting too, and this is interesting when we get into like different use cases. I remember talking to a Bwiti initiative many, many years ago, and they said that they would actually microdose the bark to work in the fields and just to work. And so even in other cultures, they have their different like dosages for what they want to do, which I find to be really fascinating.
Yeah. I've actually heard of people microdosing ibogaine. Yeah. It's funny. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then, so Matt Johnson was there too. And that's I guess a good segue into psilocybin. So psilocybin is the active compound in mushrooms. And really a lot of the research kind of kicked off with Johns Hopkins University looking at psilocybin for near-death anxiety in terminal illness. And those results, I believe, were around 75% of the people were able to really heal from their anxiety and confronting death, which was really interesting. And that population, 75%, said it was the most significant, one of the top 5 significant experiences in their lives. And the really interesting thing about psychedelics within the confine of, I guess, psychotherapy and the research is that it has prolonged effects, right? And so people, I think it was 12 to 13 months out, are still having that effect. And that's really interesting how the medicine actually works. It's, people can have these really transformative experiences, but it seems to have a very prolonged effect over time. And I didn't mention this, but I had a near-death experience when I was 16, and that's really kind of how I came into the psychedelic world. And my first psilocybin experience really reminded me of dying. And so when I read the research around that, I go, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Like what if like we have tools that can help us practice dying before dying. And I think it was maybe Charlie Grobe at UCLA or somebody in one of these documentaries, they talked about psilocybin and psychedelics as this transitory tool, right? So being able to practice death. And if we go back to ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries wasn't talked about very often because it was punishable by death. But the Greek poet Pindar described it and said it was like dying before dying. And so I remember we chatted with Dr. Catherine McLean many years ago, and she was part of that research. And, she was saying this should be a human right, right? You should be able to have an experience of going through something very powerful that could help you, confront death. And I think death is one of these taboo topics in our culture that we don't really want to confront, right? I took a death and dying class when I was over at Burlington College, and there's a quote that always stuck out at me, and it was, how you prepare for death is how you live your life, and how you live your life is how you prepare for death. And what if we had medicines that were more available to help us get in touch with that? And I found it really interesting. So yeah, a lot of that research actually started in the 60s and beforehand, but a lot of it was focused at Spring Grove down in Maryland before the 60s happened. They shut it down, and then they restarted at Hopkins in the mid 2000s. NYU also was exploring that, psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety. And I believe they're also doing some psilocybin, again, for alcohol use disorder at NYU and depression. That's another one. Imperial College has been exploring psilocybin for depression. And I think Johns Hopkins just picked that up as well.
Yeah, so there's a wide range of applications for psilocybin. That new one with Matt Johnson, he didn't talk about it at the conference, but yeah, there's a new study that they're recruiting for that has to do with alcohol use disorder with comorbid depression specifically. It's interesting. These research trials. I have tremendous amount of respect for the research, but it's a completely sanitized, sterilized subject pool. There's all kinds of exclusion criteria. And so it's interesting. It gets a little bit more murky when you start to say, well, we're going to study alcohol use disorder with comorbid depression, right? So then you have to sort of like, okay, who's legitimately got, and how do we know they don't have PTSD or dissociative disorder or some other thing? Are they excluded or not? I mean, Matt can talk more eloquently about that. But yeah, I think it's interesting because psilocybin can be used for a number of conditions. I believe they're maybe looking at it for eating disorders as well.
And then they have the whole research on smoking cessation.
Yeah, that's huge. Yep. And, along those lines, there was a New York Times article this weekend talking about the VA system, the Veteran Administration system, really starting to embrace psychedelic research now. That was a fascinating article. And one of the things they said in there is that in the past year alone, the FDA has received 16 applications for psychedelic research, which is more than the applications they've received in the previous 4 years, just in 1 year. So it shows the sort of the explosion of, and also the receptivity that the government has. What reminded me of that, Kyle, is when you said the nicotine cessation work at Johns Hopkins. So they are, and he did mention this at the conference. They, for the first time in 50 years, the National Institutes on Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse awarded a huge grant, a multi-site clinical trial for smoking cessation with psilocybin. And so that's going to be fantastic to replicate the earlier studies. And just to go back what you said before, there's a theme of death. We had Chris Bache. This might be a good segue to LSD, but Chris Bache, he wrote a few books. One of his books is called LSD in the Mind of the Universe. And he was one of the book club presenters during my CIS training. Oh, cool. And he's a philosopher. He taught philosophy at an institution for many, many years. And behind the scenes, he's also somebody who decided over the course of 20 years, he was going to go on high dose LSD journeys with his wife, with the same playlist in the same setting, 73 times over 20 years, 600 mics every time. That's 6 standard doses. And he was fascinating. And one of the things he said was every time he went in for one of these high dose sessions, he said, "Is today a good day to die?" And one has to ask oneself, if you're going to take these drugs, if you're going to, send yourself off into wherever we go, when that happens, asking yourself, is today a good day to die? Because there is, we talk about ego death and ego dissolution, but yeah, something happens where, if you can sort of trust, let go, be open, and just, ease your way into that dissolving process, it can be pretty powerful. So that was a little bit of a segue to LSD. He was a fascinating book club presenter that we got to spend six weeks with. It was cool.
600 micrograms. That's pretty significant. I think back in the early years during the research, they would do anywhere between like 200 and 500. So that's a pretty significant dose.
Yeah. LSD. I mean, and I think that, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner from Harvard, when they were writing on the subject of LSD and I think the psychedelic experience, they wrote a book, I forgot, based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead or something.
I think it was just called
Psychedelic Experience. Yeah. And in there, I think in that book, they were recommending, 200 to 500. And then Ralph Metzner in later years, I think he was like, 1 to 200 is fine. We don't need to go up above that, for people. I think he said that admittedly, people were pushing it really hard back then. Yeah.
There's not a lot of LSD research going on. Dr. Peter Gasser over in Switzerland did have a green light for compassionate use for LSD for depression. But here in the States, I feel like there's such a stigma from the 60s. And, there's also, I think, probably good clinical reason to not use LSD. It's so resource extensive. I mean, 8 to 12 hours. That's a very long day. But I did just hear that the folks over at Novamind, they're actually going to be starting an LSD research project. I forget for maybe anxiety. I think that's what it is. But I'm excited to, for more research in that world to take off.
I mean, that's where a lot of it started, right? LSD for alcohol use disorder was the bulk of the research in the 50s and 60s. So the Woodstock Research Institute in Vermont, Woodstock, Vermont, they were one of our sponsors, and they actually have a clinical trial for LSD and anxiety.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So they are looking at LSD for anxiety. It is resource intensive because it's such a long experience. And also there's something in the news that I saw recently, some company, I don't think it was Novamind, but actually making a molecule that combines LSD and MDMA, which is,
that's MindMed. Yeah,
known as candy flipping, I think, when you mix the two. So they were looking at trying to put those two together. Maybe that takes away some of the stigma if you're going to put them together in a research trial.
But they were also creating an LSD blocker to cut the trip off, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, cut it short because it is so long. But people use LSD all the time. I mean, in recreational settings, it's still a somewhat, I don't want to say popular, but it's still pretty widely used in recreational settings. So I think, the research protocols are so resource intensive when it comes to like 2 therapists and this many preparation sessions and this many integration sessions. And Rick Doblin even said, I don't know if he said it at the conference or he said it otherwise, but this is the protocol that we have now. Once it gets approved, people are free to do, they can change the protocol around, and they may only use one therapist, or they may, just structure it differently so it isn't quite as resource intensive, but still shows really good results. So I think it is resource intensive if you have to do an LSD session that's 10 hours long. But if there's ways to work with that, I think there's probably, it still could be a very helpful molecule for people.
Yeah. Does anybody know who Dr. Stanislav Grof is? Yeah. So pioneer in LSD research, wrote the book LSD Psychotherapy, and also created holotropic breathwork with his wife, Christina, which is a non-drug technique to induce a non-ordinary state. And we had him on the show, and Stan's book really kind of got me on this path. I remember reading LSD Doorway to the Numinous and said, This is my life path. And that's what brought me to Burlington College. They had a really interesting transpersonal psychology program. So I just got to study psychedelics the whole time, which was pretty cool. And also got introduced to 2 breathwork teachers, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson. So that's really where my lineage comes from. But we had him on the podcast. It was like, yes. And we were really thankful because he had a stroke a few years ago. We weren't too sure if we would get him on, but this might be a good segue into other use contexts. But we said, I asked him, what's the future of psychedelics for you? He said, to be able to buy LSD and go hiking, go swimming, and enjoy the day.
Yeah.
Which seems very controversial for a lot of people now. And I think those that are, in the research and the medicalization realm kind of push against that.
Yeah, I wish that weren't so. I mean, I said earlier that I've got personal experience with psychedelics from my youth, and I used LSD 300 to 400 times between the ages of 15 and 20. And most of that use was very low dose, hiking, swimming, hanging out. I also misused it for intentional purposes to drink more, because LSD keeps you wide awake, and it tends to knock out any kind of nausea that I might have had from drinking, because I drank too much when I was a kid. But yeah, I think that it gets a bad rap. Unfortunately, it's a very, I mean, I could credit it for changing my life significantly. So not having it studied more, not having it be a tool for a great number of people is a shame. So I hope that research continues. I'm grateful for the work of MindMed and the Woodstock research. Anybody who wants to take that on as a research project, because it's a tough one, but it's much needed, I think.
Yeah. So ceremonial use, what do we know about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to recognize with all this research, one thing that I wanted to do with the conference that we put on last week was to definitely have science as a structural model for the conference. But I really wanted to bring in the spirituality. I really wanted to bring in the community. I really wanted to bring in the history, or the sort of indigenous use or naturalistic use of these compounds, whether it's going back to the Mexican, was it Maria Sabina? And, the ritualistic use of ayahuasca, and, all this stuff has been used for a really, really long time, and arguably used safely and done in a very structured, very healthy, ritualized kind of way. There's dietas, there's intention setting.
What's a dieta for?
Dieta is like, I think my understanding is that for about a month before you have a planned ayahuasca journey, you go basically vegetarian, and you really watch what you eat. And you also, I think, some people choose a plant, some natural plant or substance that calls to them as being their guide, so to speak, for that. And so it's really a pretty strict regimen when it comes to eating habits before you have your ayahuasca.
Yeah, it's usually no sugar, no salt, no chicken and fish are okay, no red meat, pork, no sex or masturbation, anything like that. And also kind of detoxing from social media. And yeah, it's really about prepping yourself for the experience. And I think some people might do like a plant-specific dieta as well.
I mean, arguably way more intensive than the preparation that they have in their protocols for MDMA or psilocybin, like way more intense. And so, I think the argument for science is that it's it's a structure, and it's the medical model. It's trusted Western, it's going to be FDA approved, and therefore it's got to be safe because they've studied it and all that kind of stuff, which to me is like, it's an illusion. It's a game that has to be played, an unfortunate game, because of this long history, this lineage of people using these substances in healthy ways, with a healthy container, with guides, with people, with community, with themselves, with their own version of God or higher power, and guiding them through the whole process. So I can't emphasize enough how important that whole community is. The community of coaches and integration specialists and people who've been doing this work underground, in ceremonies or with individuals or families or communities for years. I mean, they just do tremendous work. And there's as much risk of, I would say, let me put that differently, because Ben Sessa would say, let's talk about safety. Yeah. There's as much safety in a structured Western medical model, clinical office setting, as there is in a jungle setting with, the shamans and the huts and the food. And I mean, they have it all very well curated in their own way. They're both safe. They're both very safe. And things can go wrong in both settings. It happens. We can't control for everything, but both, I think, are so valid. I don't think there's no wrong door when it comes to this stuff. Things can go wrong, but for the most part, things are very well done, very safe, regardless of setting.
Well, I like that you brought up like the spirituality component, because I have some colleagues that have been doing research, and one critique from one colleague said, the spiritual aspect is kind of cut out of the clinical research. And what, that brings a question like, what type of harm does that bring if that comes up for some people and it's ignored? People may not feel like their experience is valid. But on the flip side, right, Matt Johnson's talking about the caution around trying to integrate some of our own maybe spiritual beliefs into clinical research and into the clinical setting. So it's this interesting dance. But I think it's really important to honor where a lot of these medicines come from. And it brings up a really interesting question around who gets access. And being in the education space, it also brings up the question, who's able to facilitate? And right now it's really just geared towards like the medicalization. And, just because you have a degree and you're able to go get your license to do that, that gives you a step ahead versus say the shaman that just spent 15 years in the jungle or longer that probably understands the cosmology much better than any of us. I remember when I was partaking in ceremony, I remember just being there going, I don't know anything about this plant or culture. I've done so much research on it. I can understand it intellectually. The experience itself felt very familiar. I think I'm just connected to something with that whole death experience. It just felt very familiar. But on the flip side, there was something I was just like, I don't know anything about this. I don't live in the jungle. I don't like that cosmology is just so different. And, these people have been drinking ayahuasca for like 20, 30 years. They started when they were like 12. I think the shaman said, he started drinking ayahuasca when he was 12 to prepare. And, it also brings up interesting questions around training versus, you go to like a short training and that gives you the right to be able to facilitate that versus, these people that have spent decades learning directly from the plants. And, how do we honor and respect that and integrate that into our culture so it's not just so mainly medical? Medicalization, again, plays an important role. We need that. And I think certain populations are really going to need that for that kind of safe container to do psychotherapy. But what happens when people want to explore it on their own in more of a ceremonial context, in a spiritual context? What's happening in Oregon is really interesting. Has anybody been following the news over there? So they legalized adult use for psilocybin, and particularly in a service center. So they legalized psilocybin service centers. But the interesting thing is that you don't need a clinical diagnosis to get access. And the training requirements are that you need to be, right now, you need to be an Oregon resident. You need to be 21 years of age, a high school diploma, and go through a 120-hour training program plus a 40-hour practicum. But, that's really exciting because it gives those that want to explore it without a clinical indication the opportunity, and also allows those that maybe don't have a license to get involved. And I'm really interested to see kind of what scenarios pop up there. I mean, it's probably going to be a complete mess when it gets off the ground. We're kind of noticing just the mess of getting into the education space over there and how things are just, it's kind of confusing right now. But I hope that models like that stick, and I hope other states will adopt similar initiatives that it's just not so strictly siloed in the medical world.
Yeah, I hope we can do that here in Vermont. There was a bill to decriminalize all drugs here in Vermont that the governor failed to sign. No, sorry, he vetoed. He didn't fail to sign it. If he failed to sign it, it would have passed, but he vetoed it. I forgot. It had something to do with the fentanyl crisis, unfortunately. So that was unfortunate. But going back to Oregon, Jon Dennis, I think, as an attorney, you guys follow this much more closely than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I followed a little bit more closely was his attempt to really integrate the religious freedom to use these substances, and it failed. Unfortunately, it was not approved by the board, but that would have been tremendous without having to go through the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, which is what most churches now who want to set themselves up as ayahuasca churches or psilocybin churches, you can use RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to be legitimate under that. But I think Jon was trying to just integrate it into the system that was being built in Oregon right now, and that did not go through. And just to sort of piggyback on that a little bit, and you can talk more about what he was trying to do there. And that was the word entheogen. We talk about psychedelics as being the acceptable word, especially when it comes to the medical research world. It's a great word, and it was coined by psychiatrists, back in the 50s when all this stuff was starting to happen. So psychedelic is fine, but the word entheogen was coined by the, I think, philosopher or writer Carl Ruck.
Yeah.
He wrote the book, co-wrote the book Road to Eleusis, referring back to the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. And he coined the word entheogen, creating the divine within, generating the divine within. So it's a much more woo-woo spiritual term. It's one I happen to love. I think it's a great word, entheogen. And there's even the Entheogenic Practitioners Association, I believe, which is not necessarily licensed health practitioners, but people who've been doing this work. So, I think that it's interesting to help us frame the possible integration of these two seemingly diverse communities, the community of researchers and psychedelics and the community of entheogenic practitioners. And people have been doing this more sort of ceremonial stuff or religious stuff by using those terms and then sort of trying to harmonize the two in a way. So I think that Jon's work was focused on, I think he might have used the word entheogen a little bit more.
I think he did. Yeah, I don't remember. But yeah, it's sad that got shot down, but I don't think it's completely lost. He's going to continue to work on that. But I think there's only 1 or 2 legal sanctioned churches in the state. A lot of other organizations try to use part of the Native American church to get through with that. And it's kind of a weird gray area. So actually one church is in Ashland, Oregon. I forget where the other one may be. So just a little bit of, I guess, nuance there with the Freedom Restoration Act.
Also, just related to the Native American church, one molecule that we didn't talk about that also doesn't get talked about very much is mescaline. Damn. So mescaline is not seen in the research very much. It is obviously used in Santo Daime and UVD,
I just always say. Yeah, and I mean, the indigenous people in the Southwest use it. The Weechal use it.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, there are, I believe if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you type in mescaline, I believe you will see some applications for clinical trials using mescaline. Mike J. wrote a great book called Mescaline not too long ago. So it's definitely a classic, psychedelic that's been studied. It was the one I think that, Aldous Huxley took back in the day that generated some of his writings. And so I don't want to forget about mescaline.
And for those that don't know, peyote would be mescaline containing cacti, and San Pedro is also another popular one as well. Yeah. So we touched a little bit on the ceremonial psychotherapy. What about celebratory use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that whether it's celebratory or personal growth or personal curiosity, I think that, that's the thing about Oregon that's fascinating. You don't need a clinical diagnosis, that you can go to a service center and have an experience that's held in a certain way, slightly different than celebratory. I mean, the line between recreational use and celebratory use is kind of blurry, I think. But I mean, that's what we're talking about here. That's what, that's what I did when I was a kid, and that's what a lot of people do nowadays.
And you said you found benefit in that.
And I found benefit in it for sure. I mean, there was a point in which I definitely misused it in all kinds of ways, as I mentioned, as a tool to drink more or just escape or avoid or just, get fucked up or whatever it was. That's why I did it. But there's no doubt that using it with friends, connecting in certain ways, in meaningful ways with friends, and understanding myself and the world in new ways was extremely powerful. So recreational use, celebratory use, as long as it can be done in a safe way, not combining too many drugs together, I think that can happen a lot. Most of the drug deaths that we see nowadays anyway are not strictly fentanyl related. It's usually a polypharmacy or polydrug kind of thing. So, I've heard stories about, for example, people using 5-MeO DMT, a very, very powerful psychedelic, while hammered, while in the hot tub, drowning, dying. If you combine some of these things, that's not celebratory or personal growth. That's that's not good. That can happen. That's a true story. So I think that, we need to embrace all paths. And that's why I also think decriminalization may not go far enough for some people. That's an argument out there. I believe in decriminalization. I believe in legalization. There's no wrong door here. We can medicalize, we can decriminalize, we can legalize, recreationalize, buy LSD in Walmart or whatever. But I think that, having the broadest mind possible and recognizing that there are potential benefits and keeping safety top of mind.
Yeah. I was really for decriminalization. I still am. But after just talking to Joe and doing this project, I think I'm more on the lines of legalization now, just because when we think about more of these synthetic compounds, I'd rather get that stuff from a pharmacy than the underground, right? Like synthesis not happening. There's impurities in there. I remember a few years ago, DanceSafe, if nobody's heard of DanceSafe, they're like a harm reduction organization. They put out a PSA of Albert Hoffman blotter paper that was just showed up as carfentanil, right? And, you're thinking about I don't know, a naive teenager. I'm sure if I saw that, I'm not too sure if it was being sold as LSD. That's the caveat there. But, if I saw that, I'd be like, that's probably really good LSD. It's bicycle day paper. That's probably really pure. But no, it could probably have a lethal dose of carfentanil on that. Mm-hmm. And so I remember chatting with Mitch Gomez from DanceSafe, and that was something that he said. He's like, this is a new era of drug use. Like fentanyl is showing up in drugs that don't make any sense. Cross-contamination does happen. And so I think having a safe supply is really crucial. And I really kind of came from psychedelic use as more intentional and spiritual. I could never have a good time with it. I don't know. Whenever I tried to, got too internal and I needed to go be alone and process. But this is also the other interesting thing. It's, I come from the clinical spiritual background. The other co-founder, Joe, he comes more from the festival world. And we kind of have this weird little duo here where he challenges me, I challenge him. But that's something I've been really learning from folks that have been going to more festivals and doing it in more celebratory use. And having to kind of do a little bit of my own work around that of being a little judgmental there. It's no, this needs to be done in an intentional way. It needs to be done right. Versus people saying, you get to connect with people, right? And I think after just the past 2 years, connection is so important. And I remember I was at a retreat and there was somebody that was just up there chatting and, I'm at this thinking, they need to go inside. That's why they're here. And they just looked at me and said, I'm kind of sick of processing all this stuff. I just want to connect and have fun. And shouldn't that be a valid excuse to participate and engage with these substances? Yeah. That really kind of opened my eyes. I mean, he was much older, but I was like, yeah, you're right. Connection is so important. And what was it? Caroline was presenting on, isolation and just how isolated and alone a lot of people are in society right now, especially since COVID. And yeah, that should be a valid use case, taking some MDMA with some really close friends, opening up, having heart-centered conversations. I mean, when do people usually do that? Mm-hmm. I'm sure it happens, but there's something where you tap into that empathetic field with that medicine and can really open up on a deeper level. So yeah,
that happened for me. We were talking earlier about Bread and Puppet. So Bread and Puppet is a popular festival every summer in Glover, Vermont, which isn't too far from where I live now. And when I was a kid, we used to go to Bread and Puppet every year, and there was a lot of LSD being taken there. But you'd walk around the fields and see all these crazy puppets and hang out with your friends and eat bread and sit around by the fire. And it was pretty wild, And it was a real community of eccentric people like myself, and we had a really great time. And also, I think that was a lesson learned. I had a lot of deep conversations with friends for some of the time that I was using psychedelics as a kid, not all of it, and in fact, it degraded pretty quickly in my later teen years. But I eventually got sober. I was lucky enough to get really sick from alcohol and wind up in the hospital, and eventually wind up in rehab. And I've said this publicly before. I don't think I would have been receptive to the message of recovery in a 12-step based program, which has a lot of spirituality associated with it. And there's a tremendous amount of fellowship and community that comes with 12-step programs. And I had a sense of that because of my LSD use before I got sober. And so coming into recovery, knowing what I knew, having experienced what I experienced, it was a little bit easier for me to be receptive to that community, that fellowship, that message of spirituality, of surrender, of honesty, of openness, willingness, all the principles in a 12-step program. And it's just a tremendous community. And there's actually been a community that's grown up since COVID online called Psychedelics in Recovery, where a group of people have found a way to harmonize the intentional use of psychedelics in recovery, either to facilitate getting into recovery, or if someone's already in recovery and they're curious about using psychedelics to pursue their spiritual growth, to work on trauma or depression, sober, they're still not drinking, not using meth, not using sex or gambling or food in destructive ways, but wanting to see, is there a way to use psychedelics and also have a community of people where they can process it, and not go off the rails, not relapse into their drugs or behaviors of choice. So again, another example of tremendous community in a 12-step way, which is, a lot of people in traditional NA or AA may look down upon that, where you're not really sober if you're using psychedelics as part of your recovery process. But,
I have some friends that have been kind of shunned out of those circles for opening up about their ayahuasca use and whatnot.
In some cases, I think every 12-step group is an autonomous group, and every 12-step person may have a different opinion about that. So I think there are certain, real dogmatic, hard-headed, big book thumping, 12-stepping, kind of people that are totally anti anything, even antidepressants or, anything that's prescribed by a doctor to help you with your depression. And there's plenty of open-minded people as well. So some people are, shunned from traditional 12-step groups because they admit to psychedelic use. And some people are not judged at all and welcome to continue to go to their regular 12-step meeting, but also they might attend Psychedelics in Recovery as well.
How does that community, I guess, process Bill W's LSD experiences? Do they talk about it at all, or do they ignore that part of history?
Yeah, I think in the traditional AA or NA groups, the history is pretty clear that, the powers that be in AA at the time when Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of AA, was using LSD and was touting its benefits for people, that this could be the next new tool for people to help overcome their alcohol use disorder. I think he was encouraged to sort of over time keep quiet about it and not really promote it as a tool. So that kind of went away in that sort of culture, but it's still written about in some of the AA approved literature. You can read about it in a couple of books called Pass It On, another one, I think, Language of the Heart. So those are AA approved literature where you can read about it a little bit more. So the historians on AA will talk about it. It's clear that he believed in the benefits of it. So I think, I don't think modern day AA has really, especially with the new research coming out on psychedelics, has really reconciled Bill Wilson's use of LSD. But certainly this new Psychedelics of Recovery group, it's one of the opening readings. They say, one of the co-founders of AA, Bill Wilson, used LSD and had a profound, and it reminded him of his belladonna treatment back in 1934 in Towns Hospital in New York City. So I think that's changing. Over time.
Cool. I'm noticing time, and I figure we'd just open this up for more conversations. So I'll probably turn the recorder off so we're not recording everything. Anything you want to close with?
No, I think it's been a good conversation. I'm really eager to hear some questions and keep talking.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Rick Barnett. I know I had a great time just hosting this in person. And it's always fun to explore the various paradigms of use, because I feel like we're still pretty early on in the psychedelic renaissance, as they say. And I think there's a lot of exploring left to do. And I feel like we're just at the beginning on really kind of how to use these substances and medicines. And there's so much to learn from the underground as well. People have been doing this for decades, and then also looking at, the various indigenous cultures that have been using it, and so many different ways to approach it. So definitely one of my favorite topics to explore. If you have any questions, anything like that, feel free to send us an email, info@psychedelicstoday.com. Again, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so wherever you listen to podcasts and leave a review. That helps us out a bunch. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Rick Barnett's work, or if you're in the Vermont or even Northeast, and you want to check out any of the upcoming work that they're doing at the Psychedelic Society of Vermont, you can check them out at vermontpsychedelic.org. That's vermontpsychedelic.org. Again, the conference that we went to that they put on in Stowe is just magical. And, if you are in the Northeast there, and it sounds like they will be organizing some future conferences, definitely check it out. Who doesn't love spending some summers in Vermont or the fall? I think, that's when they're aiming for the fall, the equinox, and it is leaf peeping season around there. So beautiful, beautiful. So I think that is it, everybody. I'm going to head back to the ICPR conference and go check some lectures out and presentations and connect with people. So whenever you're listening to this, I hope you have a beautiful day, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today.